I was working night security at a regional airport in Northern California when the jet officially ceased to exist. That's not dramatic wording. That's the phrase that was later used in an internal report I was never meant to read. In 2018, I had been on the job for almost 7 years. Graveyard shift. Mostly boredom, routine patrols, checking hangars, watching cameras, logging tail numbers. Private aviation, not commercial terminals. Business jets, charter flights, medical transports. Quiet money. Quiet people. The night the plane disappeared started like every other night. At 11:12 p.m., a mid-sized private jet rolled onto the runway. 2 pilots. 1 passenger. Flight plan filed for a short hop to Colorado. Weather clear. No red flags. I logged the tail number like I always did and watched it lift off into the dark. By midnight it was gone. Not lost contact. Not delayed. Gone. At 12:07 a.m., the FAA system flagged the aircraft as missing. No radar. No transponder. No emergency beacon. Just an empty sky where it should have been cruising comfortably at altitude. Search and rescue was activated quickly. Too quickly. Helicopters. Ground crews. Federal agents I'd never seen before arriving at the airport within an hour. They sealed off hangars, took logs, pulled footage. They asked me questions that didn't make sense. Not what I saw, but when I saw it. They wanted to know if I was absolutely sure the jet had taken off. I said yes. That's when one of them told me something that chilled me. According to official records, the plane never left the ground. The runway cameras, they said, showed nothing. No departure. No takeoff roll. No jet leaving that night under that tail number. I told them to check the south perimeter camera. The one with the old angle. The one they usually ignored. They did. And there it was. The jet taking off exactly when I said it did. That footage disappeared before morning. The story went public 2 days later. A private jet missing over the Rockies. Presumed crash. Harsh terrain. No debris located. Passenger unnamed. Pilots unnamed. Families notified. End of story. But I knew that wasn't true. Because 3 weeks later I saw the plane again. I was doing a routine patrol near Hangar C just after midnight when something caught my eye. A jet parked where there shouldn't have been one. Same size. Same paint scheme. No visible tail number. Covered partially with a tarp like someone wanted it hidden but not moved. I froze. Private airports have records. You don't just park a jet without paperwork. Without notification. Without someone knowing. I radioed it in. My supervisor told me to stand down. That was the first time he'd ever said that. The next night, the jet was gone. 2 months later, an investigator contacted me privately. Not officially. He said he was cleaning up loose ends before retirement. He asked if I remembered the missing jet. I said yes. He told me the truth. The plane hadn't crashed. The disappearance had been staged. The passenger on board was under investigation for multiple murders tied to financial crimes. He wasn't supposed to leave the country. But arresting him publicly would have exposed something larger. Money laundering tied to aviation charters and shell companies. So they erased the flight. Midair, the pilots shut down all tracking systems. They diverted to a restricted desert airstrip used for non-standard operations. The passenger was transferred. The plane was dismantled over weeks, sold in parts under different serials. The crash story was a cover. Search teams were theater. The families were paid quietly. The pilots? Witness protection. The jet I saw in Hangar C was the last physical piece of evidence before it vanished forever. The investigator told me all this because he was dying. Because the case was closed. Because no one would believe me anyway. He was right. I still work nights sometimes. Different airport now. Same job. Same dark skies. Every time I see a private jet take off after midnight, I wonder if it will land where it says it will. Or if one day it will simply stop existing again. Because now I know something most people don't. Planes don't always disappear because of accidents. Sometimes they're made to vanish. And the paperwork always says they never left the ground. I was the last person to speak to the crew before the plane disappeared, and for a long time, I believed that meant the disappearance was my fault. In 2020, I worked as a load and documentation officer for a cargo airline operating out of the Midwest. It wasn't a glamorous job. I verified manifests, checked weight distribution, confirmed hazardous material declarations, and signed off before aircraft doors were sealed. Cargo flights run on trust and routine. Once paperwork is cleared, nobody asks many questions. That's how things slip through. The flight was scheduled to depart just after midnight. A wide-body cargo plane carrying electronics, medical equipment, and several sealed containers listed as industrial machinery. Domestic route. Nothing unusual on paper. The crew was experienced. I had worked with the captain before, quiet, efficient, the kind of pilot who didn't waste words. About 20 minutes before departure, one of the containers caught my attention. The serial number didn't match the format used by the shipping company listed on the manifest. It was subtle. One extra digit. Most people wouldn't notice. I almost didn't. I called operations to verify it. They told me it had already been cleared. That didn't sit right with me. Clearances usually came after verification, not before. I walked out to the tarmac and asked the captain directly if he'd been briefed on the special cargo. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary before answering. He said yes. Then quietly he asked me if I had children. I remember feeling confused by the question. I said no. He nodded like that meant something and told me to sign the release so they could close the doors. I signed. The plane took off on time. No delays. No issues reported. I watched it climb on the monitor and disappear into the dark. That was the last normal thing about that night. At 2:13 a.m., the aircraft dropped off all tracking systems simultaneously. No gradual loss. No warning. One moment it was cruising. The next it was gone. Dispatch assumed a system failure at first. Then ATC called. Then management. Then people whose names weren't on any organizational chart. By sunrise, the story was already forming. The plane had vanished somewhere over a remote stretch of land. Terrain made recovery difficult. Search efforts were underway. I knew something was wrong when the search area didn't match the last known coordinates I'd seen. It was off by miles. I said nothing. For weeks, the disappearance dominated internal communications. Families were notified. Public statements were carefully worded. No mention of cargo details. No mention of crew conversations. Just silence and speculation. Then the questions started, directed at me. Investigators asked about the container. About whether I remembered anything unusual. About whether anyone had pressured me. I answered truthfully but carefully. I didn't mention the captain's question about children. I didn't mention the clearance that came too early. They already knew. The truth came out months later, not officially, but through fragments I wasn't supposed to piece together. The plane didn't crash. It diverted. The cargo container I noticed wasn't machinery. It was modified, reinforced, soundproofed. Inside it was a person, alive when the doors closed. The flight was part of a coordinated crime involving multiple insiders. The crew wasn't transporting cargo. They were transporting evidence. A witness in a massive criminal case involving organized financial crime and violent offenses. Someone who was never supposed to testify. The disappearance was staged to erase that person completely. Mid-flight, tracking systems were disabled manually. The plane descended below radar coverage, landed at an abandoned airstrip used decades earlier for military training, and transferred the container to a ground team. The aircraft was then flown to a separate location, dismantled, and its parts distributed across several countries under falsified records. No wreckage was ever meant to be found. The crew didn't survive long after. Not in a crash. In accidents. One by one. The captain was the last. I found that out the day a federal agent came to my house with a folder and a warning. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't have to. He told me the case was closed, the perpetrators identified, and justice served in ways I wouldn't read about. He told me I'd done nothing wrong. But he also told me to stop looking. I quit my job the next morning. Sometimes I think about the person inside that container. About the moment the engines roared and they realized they weren't being saved. They were being erased. About how many signatures, stamps, and approvals it took to make that disappearance possible. Planes don't vanish by accident. Not like that. They vanish because enough people decide it's easier for the sky to swallow the truth than for it to land safely. I still sign my name carefully now, even on meaningless documents, because I know how powerful a signature can be, and how quietly it can make someone disappear. wasn't supposed to notice the gap. That's the part that still bothers me the most, how small the mistake was. One missing timestamp. 37 minutes that didn't exist. If I hadn't been obsessive about details, the disappearance would have passed as just another aviation anomaly filed away and forgotten. In 2015, I worked as a civilian analyst contracted to review flight telemetry for a government-adjacent aviation safety program. My role was boring by design. I reviewed post-flight data, compared radar logs, checked inconsistencies, and flagged anything that didn't align with standard operating procedures. I wasn't law enforcement. I wasn't intelligence. I was supposed to be invisible. The flight that vanished wasn't. It was a charter aircraft, twin-engine turboprop, operating a late-night route between two small U.S. cities. No passengers listed publicly. Officially, it was a corporate repositioning flight. Empty cabin. 2 pilots only. Low media interest. Exactly the kind of flight nobody watches closely. Until it disappeared. According to public records, the plane took off just before midnight and vanished less than an hour later. No distress call. No weather issues. No debris found. The FAA summary concluded probable crash due to unknown causes. Case closed quietly. But when the data reached my desk weeks later, something felt wrong immediately. The flight didn't end abruptly. It ended cleanly. Most crashes show chaos in the data. Altitude fluctuations, speed changes, erratic headings. This flight didn't. The telemetry stopped at a perfectly stable cruise. Straight line. Constant speed. As if someone had simply unplugged the sky. More disturbing was the radar handoff log. The aircraft transitioned between coverage zones smoothly, except for one gap. 37 minutes with no recorded position, followed by a reappearance, brief, faint, and then gone again for good. That reappearance wasn't in the official report. I dug deeper. Pulled raw feeds instead of summaries. Compared civilian radar with restricted feeds I technically wasn't authorized to access but could see through system overlap. What I found made my stomach drop. The plane hadn't vanished where they said it did. It had landed. There was a faint ground return at a remote airstrip in the southwest. One not listed on current aviation charts. An abandoned strip, officially decommissioned decades earlier. But the data didn't lie. Something landed there. Something with the same mass, speed, and signature as the missing aircraft. I reported the discrepancy. Within hours, my supervisor called me into his office. He looked nervous, which was unusual for a man who normally treated numbers like emotions didn't exist. He told me the data set was corrupted. He told me to revise my findings. He told me not to pursue it further. That was the first time in my career I was told not to be accurate. I didn't listen. I kept copies. I mapped the flight path manually. I noticed another detail, one that hadn't stood out before. The plane wasn't empty. The weight distribution indicated cargo. Heavy cargo. Secured mid-cabin. That contradicted the filed flight plan. A week later, federal agents came to my office. Not to ask questions. To give instructions. They confiscated my workstation. Had me sign paperwork. Reminded me of confidentiality clauses I'd signed years earlier and never thought about. They told me the aircraft had been involved in criminal misuse, and that the matter was resolved. I asked what happened to the crew. They didn't answer. Months passed. The case faded from memory, but I couldn't let it go. I started researching quietly off the clock. Old records, corporate registrations, shell companies tied to the charter operator. Eventually, a pattern emerged. The plane wasn't transporting people. It was transporting money, physical currency. Millions of dollars tied to an interstate crime network involving fraud, extortion, and contract killings. The disappearance wasn't an accident, it was an extraction. The pilots were complicit. So was the charter company. They staged the vanishing to wipe the flight from public accountability. The money was offloaded at the abandoned strip and moved by ground convoy before dawn. The aircraft itself was flown again under a different identifier, repainted, re-registered, and quietly sold overseas. The official crash narrative bought everyone time. What they didn't count on was greed. 2 years later, one of the men involved tried to leverage the secret for protection during an unrelated arrest. He talked too much. Federal prosecutors reopened sealed aviation records. My old analysis resurfaced, quietly validated. I was contacted again. This time not as a liability but as a witness. The case never made the news. It didn't need to. Arrests were made under financial crime statutes. Sentences handed down quietly. The pilots were already dead, one from an accident, the other from a medical emergency. On paper, the plane is still listed as missing, but I know where it went. I know it touched the ground. I know it flew again. I know it was never lost, just hidden long enough for the crime to succeed. Every time I hear about a plane that disappears without a trace, I think about that gap in the data. 37 minutes that didn't exist. 37 minutes where a crime unfolded perfectly because everyone involved trusted that the sky would keep its secrets. Most of the time it does. But sometimes, if you look closely enough, you can still see where the truth briefly came back down to earth. I didn't believe the plane had disappeared until I stood inside it. By then, the story had already been in the news for months. A domestic flight, dozens of passengers, clear weather, routine route, then nothing, radar loss, no distress call, no debris. The phrase disappeared without a trace was repeated so often it lost meaning. For everyone else it was a mystery. For me it became an assignment. In 2019, I worked as a forensic auditor specializing in transportation fraud. My job wasn't glamorous. I followed money, paperwork, and logistics after accidents, making sure insurance claims, asset write-offs, and salvage reports matched reality. Most of the time they did. Sometimes they didn't, and that's when things got interesting. I was brought in quietly off the books to review financial anomalies related to the missing flight. The airline's insurance claim was massive, but what caught attention wasn't the payout, it was what wasn't claimed. No compensation requests from certain vendors. No salvage operations billed. No disposal records for parts that should have existed even in a total loss. It was as if the plane had never been built. At first, I assumed incompetence. Then I assumed fraud. I didn't yet assume murder. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Serial numbers tied to the aircraft began showing up in unrelated transactions overseas. Not complete parts, components, landing gear assemblies, avionics modules. Things that should have been destroyed or unrecoverable if the plane had crashed where they said it did. I flagged it. 2 weeks later, I received a call telling me to stop. No explanation, just instructions. That's when I knew I was close. I started working on my own time using public records and old contacts. I traced the components through shell companies and re-registrations. Eventually, everything pointed to one place, a long-abandoned airfield in the southern desert, officially decommissioned, unofficially untouched. I drove there alone. The runway was cracked, half buried by sand, but unmistakable. And parked inside a hangar with a rusted sliding door was the plane everyone thought was gone. Same fuselage, same dimensions, same scars near the nose from a minor bird strike months before its disappearance. Something only internal maintenance reports had mentioned. The plane hadn't crashed. It had landed. Inside, the cabin was empty. Seats removed. Flooring stripped. No personal items. No luggage. No signs of panic. Just quiet, stale air and the feeling that something terrible had happened cleanly, efficiently. That night, I slept in my car and called the authorities the next morning. They already knew. Within hours, the site was swarming with people who didn't introduce themselves. I was questioned, not thanked. My notes were taken. My phone copied. I was told to leave and not return. But the truth came out anyway. Slowly. Carefully. Enough to close the case. The disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a crime. The flight had been selected for one reason: liability. On board were 2 passengers tied to a multi-state criminal investigation involving contract killings and financial crimes. Arresting them publicly would have triggered retaliation and exposed informants. Letting them fly was the solution. Mid-flight, tracking systems were disabled with insider access codes. The pilots diverted to the desert strip. There was no struggle, no hijacking. Everyone on board was compliant until the doors closed. What happened next was never fully written down, but enough evidence remained. The passengers were removed and executed off-site. The crew was eliminated later under unrelated pretenses. The plane was stripped, sold in pieces, and officially declared lost to the sky. Insurance paid out. Files were sealed. Careers continued. The plane's disappearance was solved, not by wreckage, but by accounting. When the case was formally closed, the public explanation was simple. New evidence confirmed a catastrophic crash with no recoverable remains. The desert airfield was never mentioned. Neither were the murders. I was offered a settlement to keep quiet. I took it, not because I wanted the money, because I understood what happens to people who don't. Sometimes, when I see headlines about planes that vanish, I think about how comforting mystery is. How people prefer unanswered questions to answers that involve planning, coordination, and ordinary humans deciding who gets to exist and who doesn't. The sky didn't take that plane. People did. And they made sure it disappeared so completely that even now, most believe it never touched the ground again.